Welcome to our honors option presentation about cystic fibrosis. This was written and recorded by Ashley Dobbin, Wyatt Feldman, Finn Sears, and Taylor Smith.
Cystic fibrosis is characterized as an autosomal recessive disorder, which is very prevalent in the respiratory and digestive tract. In the respiratory tract, it is characterized by mucus buildup, which is caused by the mechanism of an ion channel, which will be described in the next slide. And in the digestive tract, it is characterized by blockades, either in the pancreas or the small intestine, which inhibit their functions, producing many of the symptoms that we see with cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis occurs when the transmembrane protein that is produced by the gene is not produced in a significant amount or is produced in a way where the efficiency of the protein itself is inhibited, such as a shape change, or if the protein is not produced at all. This transmembrane protein acts as an ion channel and helps maintain the balance of salt and water throughout the body, which is very important on a cellular level. When chloride ions are not able to pass through in the correct amount or are creating blockades, water is not able to come and rehydrate the cell. So organelles such as cilia on top of surface cells inside the body are not able to be hydrated and release the mucus and clear the buildup of mucus on the lining of cells. This is what produces the thick blockades that are characterized by cystic fibrosis. In the respiratory tract, the cells that line the organs, such as the lungs, are affected in a way where chloride ions create a block in the ion channel that the cystic fibrosis transmembrane protein acts in, which inhibits water from entering the cell and creating that watery mucus that is able to be rid of by the body. Instead, this mucus forms a buildup, and this is where we have the deep mucus cough forming, along with wheezing and bacteria remaining inside the airways and creating many airway infections. Now, the digestive tract is also affected by cystic fibrosis, believe it or not. And this is because the chloride ions that act in this ion channel between the salt and water balance within the body are actually blocking other enzymes from passing through that same ion channel and helping to process foods or help functions in the small intestine and the pancreas. This is what leads to symptoms like constipation or intestinal blockage or foul smelling due to the undigested foods within the small intestine and the enzymes that are not able to reach the pancreas.
Hi, my name is Finn Sears, and I will be covering the genetics of cystic fibrosis. To begin, how does one develop cystic fibrosis? In order to develop cystic fibrosis, you must inherit two mutated copies of the CFTR gene. Well, you must get one from your dad and then one from your mom as well. Cystic fibrosis is mainly caused by mutations sustained to the CFTR gene. It is not caused by another mutation, really any other gene. The CFTR gene itself is 6,128 base pairs. It has 27 exons after splicing, and the end protein has 1,480 amino acids. Some common mutations that can be suffered from the CFTR gene include conduction mutations, protein processing mutations, gating mutations, and insufficient protein mutations. I'll give an example of each in the following slides. To begin, we have protein processing mutations. This is one of the most common mutations that can be sustained and found on patients with cystic fibrosis. And this occurs, or a protein processing mutation occurs when there is a protein made, but it does not reach the cell surface to regulate the chloride ions. The most famous example is F508L, which is the deletion of the 508th codon. And this results in the loss of the 508th amino acid, which is a phenylalanine. And this is an essential protein needed to help make the CFTR protein maintain its shape and carry out its tasks of allowing certain amount of chloride ions into the cell. This is the most common mutation and makes up for at least 70% of patients with cystic fibrosis, and it is believed to stem from a founder's effect occurred in Central Europe around 350 BC. The next mutation is known as a conduction mutation. This is when a protein is made and it reaches the cell surface, therefore it is able to do a part of its job, but it does not regulate the correct amount of chloride ions into the cell. This specific mutation causes too few chloride ions to get into the cell. A specific mutation is known as R117H mutation. This is a single nucleotide substitution where the 117th codon is switched from CGC, which is an arginine, to CAC, resulting in a histidine. This mutation is not a really strong cause of cystic fibrosis and is usually needs another strong mutation such as a deletion F508del in order for a patient to develop cystic fibrosis. As seen in this picture here, we have minor mutations, which is the class 4 of R117 versus severe mutations such as 508del right here. Gating mutations are similar to the previous conduction mutations, where in gating mutations, a protein is also made and it reaches the cell surface, but it does not let in any chloride ions at all. So the chloride ion channel is instead completely blocked, as seen in this picture here on the right, instead of a regular CFTR channel, which regulates the correct amount of chloride ions into the cell. So the cell does not get any chloride ions. A specific mutation is known as G551D. This is a single nucleotide substitution as well, where the 551st codon is changed from GGC to GAC. This changes the 551st amino acid from a glycine to aspartic acid. This results in the protein as, again, not being able to fold correctly and results in a completely blocked off channel. G551D is another one of the most common mutations for cystic fibrosis and for gating mutations. Finally, we have insufficient protein mutations. This occurs when a protein is made and reaches the cell surface, but not enough of these proteins are actually functional. This is caused primarily by nonsense mutations, and depending on where the stop codon is placed in these nonsense mutations, you have varying systems of cystic fibrosis. So the first example is R553X, which places the stop codon at the 553rd position. This is primarily closer to the 5' end of the mRNA, and as a result, you lose a lot of genetic code. So the resulting protein is basically completely inoperable. Whereas you have R1162X, which places the stop codon at the 1162nd position. Now this, again, the amino acid chain created by the CFTR mRNA is only 1,480 amino acids long. So in this case, you're losing a really small bit of genetic code, and the protein is still operable and functional.
Normally, if something is not beneficial and is in fact harmful to survival, evolution will cause it to fade out. So why is it still around? To help explain why, we can look at Tinbergen's 4 questions, which are the mechanism, adaptive value, ontogeny, and phylogeny. Next slide. So the first question is, what causes this disease? This disease is due to a change in the sequence of the CFTR gene. How did it develop? It develops when one nucleotide mutation happens in the CFTR gene. In fact, there are about 45 different mutations that can occur that cause this disease. A simple change to this gene changes its function, causing cystic fibrosis to occur. What is the adaptive function? The CFTR gene holds the code for the body to make transmembrane proteins that allow a certain type of material to go through ion channels. This is important for our body because it correlates with how our body deals with mucus in the lungs. If mucus were to be in the lungs, it would cause serious breathing issues and people would not survive. This is what happens when the gene is mutated and does not function properly. So even though cystic fibrosis is not an important survival trait, in fact, it's the opposite, it comes from a gene that is essential for all human life. What is the evolutionary advantage of cystic fibrosis? As stated before, it is due to a mutation in the CFTR gene. Since the CFTR gene is essential for human life, it's just a byproduct of that. Next slide. We can also look at the proximate and ultimate explanations to help us understand. The proximate explanation explains that the disease is due to a change in the CFTR gene, as stated before. Basically, it makes worse transport membranes, which results in water to no longer be attracted to the cell wall. This is because the chloride ions cannot create a charge for the water to stick to, and then it can't escape the cell. This causes the mucus to be dehydrated, causing a thicker mucus that inhibits the function of the cilia in the lungs, causing the mucus to be stuck. The ultimate explanation is due to the CFTR gene being essential for human life. When it works properly, the opposite of what I just stated happens, and it allows the body to function properly. Next slide. With a disease so awful, how is it possible that it's still around? There is a chance that cystic fibrosis could be present in the population due to an antagonistic pleiotropy. However, it's still not fully understood, and there's not a lot of research on if there's a positive side to this. So we don't know for sure if there's a benefit of having it when you're younger. So right now, there's really not a good explanation to see if there's a good antagonistic pleiotropy there, but there's a potential that it could be.
So now that we know about the evolutionary perspective of cystic fibrosis, it's important to understand what kind of treatments can be used to manage the symptoms of this condition. So cystic fibrosis is a very unique condition in the way that it doesn't impact each patient in the same way. So the care and treatment is kind of on a patient-to-patient basis, depending on the symptoms that are present within the body. So some of these most common symptoms include lung damage, that lead to increased bacterial infection, increased respiratory infection, and or swelling. Also, a very prevalent symptom is thick mucus that prevents proper width of airways, as well as proper absorption of food into the intestines. And then wheezing and cough is also a very common symptom. But ultimately, cystic fibrosis requires treatments to maintain these symptoms and to improve life expectancy and life quality. But ultimately, there is no cure as of right now to cystic fibrosis. And then over on the right, there's this picture that shows the thickening mucus in yellow that kind of shows how it obstructs the airways of the patient. So it compares it to a healthy airway versus a narrowed airway that is blocked by mucus that makes it hard for the patient to breathe. So again, most of the treatments for cystic fibrosis are geared towards the lungs because typically this is the organ that is most impacted by this condition. Antibiotics are used to eliminate and or slow the growth of the common bacterial pathogen found in cystic fibrosis. A lot of patients that start antibiotics have the best results when they start early. And it also improves their lung functionality as well as getting rid of the infection. The narrowing airways are prevalent among some patients, and it is important for these patients to consistently take anti-inflammatories to minimize the severity of obstructed airways and thus increase the ability for cystic fibrosis patient to breathe. So again, these treatments are really just trying to manage the symptoms, make the patient comfortable. It won't totally get rid of the infection or the thickening mucus, but we are just trying to manage the symptoms so that the patient can breathe. So more about the lungs, because again, cystic fibrosis is very prevalent in the lungs. So the thick mucus shown on the previous slide can be relieved by also administering a mucus thinning drug. It's called hypertonic saline. This is inhaled by the patient, so it does multiple things to kind of get rid of this thick mucus that's narrowing the airways. So it hydrates the airways, it thins the mucus, and overall, again, just improves breathing and life quality. And then another inhaled medication that is sometimes used for the airway obstruction is broncholators. They're used to calm the muscles that surround the airways, ultimately improving lung function as well. But again, none of these cure the condition, just manage the symptoms. And then we always try to go the least invasive way possible. But sometimes the organs are so damaged by cystic fibrosis that the patients are left with no choice except surgery. These candidates include those who have experienced organ failures or are resistant to antibiotics and their bacterial infections have not been cured in the lungs, for example. So then they'll do things like get lung transplants. Again, these are only in patients that have like extreme lung damage that has not been improved by antibiotics. And then liver transplants are also common in patients who experience liver failure. So that's kind of it for the surgical treatments for cystic fibrosis. And then lastly, cystic fibrosis greatly impacts the digestive system. So the thickening mucus that comes along with the condition, it impacts the body's ability to break down and absorb nutrients. So this thick mucus essentially decreases the pancreas's ability to deliver enzymes to the intestines. So one thing that's used as far as the intestines goes is oral pancreatic enzyme therapy, which allows the body to replace the necessary enzymes that play the role in food absorption, because again, getting nutrition is very important to the human body and life expectancy. In some extreme cases, patients will have a temporary or permanent feeding tube to ensure proper nutrition. So sometimes they get one through the nose and down into the stomach, or they can get a permanent one in their stomach. Again, it's just because this thick mucus is preventing enzymes from flowing through the body, so the body is not able to break down nutrients as well. And this photo just kind of shows how cystic fibrosis can cause intestinal inflammation and or bacterial infections that inhibit the ability to absorb nutrients. And that is all for our cystic fibrosis presentation. Thank you very much for watching.